Hey, everybody, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX. Excited to be with you today as I continue my series of conversations with leaders during this pandemic. And I've got Jonathan Reckford here, really eager to hear what he has to say. Jonathan is, of course, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity International. And one big aspect of this pandemic is what it means for housing. I mean, so many of us, like myself, are sitting in our homes and figuring out what the new reality is going to be like because of that. And of course, many people are in much tougher situations all over the world. And this is something Habitat works on every day, whether there's a pandemic or not. And so I was really eager to get your take, Jonathan, on all that this pandemic has meant for your organization, for the issues of housing that you work on, and just for people's awareness. Habitat for Humanity has been around since 1976. I think everybody knows it to some degree. I think they may learn a little bit more about it in this discussion, but you are acknowledged to be by many America's largest private home builder. I think you've helped put 29 million people or more into housing around the world. You're in 70 countries and all 50 US states. And really have an incredible legacy that you built over these last so many years. And so I'd love to get your take as somebody who has worked on these issues. And for people who are maybe noticing, we both are doing the same thing. We put our books over our shoulders. Jonathan is not only the CEO at Habitat, but he's the author of Our Better Angels, which came out last year. Worth having a read if you haven't. I've got a copy of that somewhere around here, Jonathan. Thanks again for doing this with us.
My pleasure, Raj. It's great to be with you. Great to catch up. I so wish for so many reasons we could be doing this live, because that would mean our world was in a better place. And it's as we have all had to adapt to the COVID crisis. Just at a high level, you already set the tone. We had a global housing crisis before COVID happened, and this is just exacerbated. And I think for those of us for whom working at home is an inconvenience, we can all imagine what it means for those people who don't have adequate housing to begin with. And that command to shelter in place if you're living in terribly overcrowded or inadequate shelter or don't have shelter is really an impossibility. And so what we are seeing, unfortunately, is a growing crisis, particularly in the informal settlements. So roughly 1 billion people now worldwide live in slum conditions, 1.6 billion live in inadequate or substandard housing. And so take all the risks of COVID, and it's that much worse for almost a quarter of our world. And of course, in the low income context, it's even harder. And as your viewers and readers know so well, even if COVID isn't huge in many of these countries, the impact of COVID is still heartbreakingly devastating. So I've been talking to different national directors, and take a place like Cambodia that at least officially doesn't have very many COVID cases, but when you take away all of the tourism and then take away all of the remittances as people are losing jobs and being sent home, it is sending huge numbers of people back into extreme poverty. And I think in some ways we are in risk of undoing 25 years of progress in international development as we see the ripples of impact from this. Go ahead.
I was just gonna comment that the crisis has done a lot to kind of amplify existing trends, right? A lot of the inequalities in the world that we all were working on in our community that we know so well, they're just so much more apparent at a moment like this when you're told, go shelter in place or wash your hands, and we realize how many people don't have access to clean water in their home. It really underlines that. But I wonder if you could set for people a sense, because people know Habitat is building homes, but of course you're also an advocate for affordable housing and changing policies and laws and regulations to drive that. But what was that picture before the pandemic in terms of, why are there so many people who are in informal settlements or slums, or why have housing costs, not just in rich countries, even in poor countries, exploded in urban areas? Why has housing become such a big percentage of people's annual spend? How do you see the broad picture that has now put us in such a crisis situation when it comes to housing?
That's a great frame. And if we pull all the way back, the global demographic shift that is really unstoppable is rapid urbanization. And it makes sense from an economic perspective. People move to cities for jobs, but most of the cities of the world were designed for having infrastructure for a far smaller population. And one of the things I've observed is housing is complex and expensive. And so most of the people in power, which is self-fulfilling, in most countries, both in the private sector and public sector, have good housing. So it's not always visceral, I think, the same way that health and education are in terms of planning. The biggest mistake I think cities have made over and over again is not holding land as they build out infrastructure and thinking ahead about housing. So, Singapore's done it really well. South Korea's done it better than most, but for the most part, countries haven't built out the infrastructure or allocated land. So you end up with people coming in and just filling in, either squatting, creating informal settlements. And I think the downside of that is everyone loses. What we see, the other thing we've seen really exacerbated in US trends, but it's true globally as well, is housing is obviously not the only need, but it's so deeply interrelated with all the other needs. You talked about water and sanitation, and clearly health and housing is right now we're seeing the painful evidence of the deep connection between health and housing. But if children don't have stability and don't have housing and don't stay healthy, they don't do well in school, then they have a tougher time earning an income, and you see families trapped in this cycle of poverty. So from a long-term planning perspective, my belief is that we have to change the way markets work so that families can improve their own housing. And the biggest shift for Habitat for Humanity was moving from the idea that we will build, all the houses, which was always supposed to be a demonstration project, to, we use the language of, could we be a partner and catalyst for worldwide access to safe, decent, affordable housing? And that forced us into a big shift towards housing policy. And then second shift into trying to address the housing value chain and help markets work better for very low income families. So to give a short version of that, if you're a low income family in so many countries, one, you may have lived on your land for generations, but never have had the legal right to stay there. So that's a huge barrier if you don't have property rights. So that's a huge focus of our policy and advocacy work, particularly for women and marginalized groups. But second, banks traditionally wouldn't lend to low income families. If you're not in that sort of A or B category, there's no way to get a housing loan. So we became a pioneer in housing microfinance and have tried to demonstrate that there actually is a market for small home improvement loans for very low income families. And now we launched a wholesale fund, and that has really started work. And then the next step we've been trying to work on is how do you make sure that families who, if they can get property rights and access to finance, can then get good quality construction support and good building materials at fair prices. And so we have been working, supporting entrepreneurs, bringing better housing products to the market. All of this is getting interrupted by COVID. So, you had a context where so many families didn't have access before, and sadly, I think the hurdles just got higher for us.
Yeah, I was just smiling thinking about how big this little demonstration project actually is. I get your point in the sea of need there. There's only so much Habitat can build, but you have built a lot of houses over the years. I wonder, it seems to me that housing as an issue has been a tough one to get political attention around, to get international organizations to focus on. I know that inside the World Bank or inside USAID or DFID, there's got to be people who are housing experts, but boy, it's not the kind of thing we hear a lot coming out of those agencies and others. Is it harder now to get attention on this issue? Or has there been an opening? Like, thinking about your mortgage finance business, you're trying to, help people get lower cost access to finance. Is that in some ways, are governments listening to you more in this moment of crisis? Are aid agencies listening to you more? Or are you finding it's even harder to get considered a priority when there's so many direct health priorities that are out there today?
I would say when COVID first broke out, we were really concerned because all the energy rightly was going into emergency and health relief. And we wouldn't argue with that. There was a desperate need for it. I would say as that has rolled forward, and people, I think as all of us are at home, working at home, spending time at home, in some ways, my hope is that's actually made people think a little bit more about how critical their housing is. And for people suddenly, I laughed, even the minor inconvenience of having a college student and my professional son and myself all trying to have home offices and work simultaneously and share the internet. That's a mild inconvenience, but I do think that's brought more attention to housing. Now, I still think it's a battle to get housing higher on the agenda because there's so many governments that are under just duress right now. And I can think about even in the United States, our mayor of my hometown of Atlanta ran on a housing platform, passed housing bonds, COVID hit, the budget crisis, and they canceled the housing bond. So it's not that they don't care, but I do worry about ability. Now, sometimes out of these, you can create opportunities as well. And it may be that there are chances, particularly around land. I mean, so much of the challenge of housing is land. And sometimes our view would be if government can focus on creating the infrastructure and allocating land, the market can then actually figure out how to get the housing built, rather than the government needing to build all the housing. But you still need land, and that's the great conundrum. And generally, when we polled in the past, housing would come in 5, 6, or 7. But if you poll the people who don't have housing, it's always in their top 2, right? So it is creating awareness. And one of the reasons Habitat has engaged volunteers is not because that's really a construction strategy, but because that's a deeply embedded in our social change strategy, because it does create a chance for people to cross barriers, socioeconomic, which might be the biggest barriers, as well as ethnic, racial, religious, and see how other people are living in a way that we hope then turns them into advocates and supporters of better housing policy.
I want to, in a minute, get back into these questions about land and some of the future, what the pandemic may have changed, but maybe we just take a minute to hear more about Habitat itself and how the pandemic has affected you. You've got retail stores, I know that's a big part of what you do. I imagine a lot of them had to be shut down. What's the status of that? Your volunteers, are they able to go out and build homes today? And what's sort of the picture? What has this meant to the organization you lead?
This has been, we don't have the right adjectives. Unprecedented doesn't really do justice. We have faced many natural disasters. When I joined Habitat, we had the Indian Ocean tsunami, then Hurricane Katrina in the US. So huge scale disasters, but never something that hit the whole world at once. So this one has been the toughest thing we've certainly faced, because initially it virtually shut us down. So if you take the different pieces, obviously in all the countries that had shelter-in-place requirements, we had to stop our work. In many places, construction was considered a critical task, but all of our volunteers, we were actually quick to stop our volunteer. The first thing we stopped early on was international volunteering, because we just didn't want to take the possible risk of someone inadvertently bringing COVID to a vulnerable community. So we stopped that. And then that's not meaningful from a number of units built perspective, but that is important from a fundraising perspective. So that is that's a source of unrestricted funding for our country programs that they can use as match funds for other larger donors and grants. And so it is painful, and those programs are shut down certainly through the calendar year and until conditions are safe. Then the next step was our domestic volunteering stopped. And so our US affiliates moved doing, where they were allowed to, doing construction just with professional staff and subcontractors to finish the houses that were already under construction and keep things moving. Our retail stores, we have a chain, mostly US, though we do have some international stores.
Restore, it's called.
It's called Habitat for Humanity Restores. We have almost 1,000 stores. Last year, it was a $550 million of revenue. So these are our thrift stores. We get donated products from people remodeling or moving or changing their houses, and we resell those products. Those all shut down, but they have begun coming back. So, but of course, now as things are getting worse, that is getting stressed. But we had put in new safety protocols and contactless pickup for the donated products, and sort of changed the way we do our practices, and that those are coming back up, but not to the level they were pre-COVID, but is returning. One of the big issues, and a lot of people don't realize, is we don't give away the houses, families pay mortgages. So we are a lender, and one of the big risks we had is as families are hurt, they wouldn't be able to afford their mortgages. And we are the friendliest lender out there, so we would quickly restructure or create forbearance. But families so far have paid reasonably well, but we do worry about the long-term impact, as a lot of these service jobs may not come back. And in the same way, in the international markets, those housing microfinance loans have held up reasonably well, but we do worry about families' ability to pay if they can't work. So it is, so this has impacted us heavily. At the country level, we've seen a lot of creativity. In the US, we started with the most basic stuff. We donated all our stores of PPP, all of our safety equipment to hospitals and health workers, because we thought that was the highest need. In the international arena, we increased our work in the water and sanitation space, because that was the most immediate needs. So hygiene kits and support for hand washing stations clean. So we shifted resources to try to make sure we could help with community health as much as possible. And then as we're able to, moving our program work more towards upgrading and safety and health improvements of housing as a clear focus. And we're seeing, that countries are beginning to reopen now. I was talking about Cambodia, that's an example. They've changed the model a little bit. So now families, instead of doing traditional sweat equity, we didn't want them working alongside the construction workers. So we're doing more training and online and finding different ways for them to support their participation. The construction workers, we've attached face shields to all the hard hats so that they can, we have new protocols for sanitizing tools for making work. We're trying to make sure that we can get people back to work, because of course, as you know so well, Raj, in many of these contexts, if people don't work, they can't eat. This is a crisis. So we want to create jobs in local community if we can do it safely as fast as we can.
Yeah, one reason probably your mortgage finance business has held up reasonably well is the US has the wherewithal to do massive fiscal stimulus and to do unemployment benefits and all these things that have helped poor families to continue to get through this, even if they've lost their service jobs and others. But that's obviously not the case in so many of the other countries where you work. There just isn't the fiscal space to do that. Have you had to face what so many NGOs are facing with layoffs or furloughs or salary cuts or those kinds of things? Have you been able to muddle through so far without that? Where do you stand at this point?
We did have to make some hard decisions. As we looked at it, we tried to look at parallels. There weren't any, but we looked at the 08, 09, 10 recession and looked at our financials from then. And we made a painful decision to cut about 10% of our umbrella group, our international team, and our senior team took a voluntary pay cut. And we did that really to minimize the chance we'd have to make more cuts later to lower the run rate, but also to make sure we had some margin to be able to support our country programs and affiliates. So we realigned our services to really be about helping our national organizations and U.S. affiliates navigate the crisis. I'm encouraged. Fundraising has held up better than we expected. And again, that hopefully is, we've had a lot, as you said, a lot of transfer payments to the U.S. The U.S. is still our largest single source of funds. I'm still pretty conservative though, as I look at the next 24 months. We think this is could be a tough road for all nonprofits. So we wanted to come in with a conservative stance.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm glad to hear it is holding up. We've been running a regular tracking survey, the DevEx COVID Trends Tracker, and it's pretty sobering because you see, the percentage of people in the development and aid and health communities talking about layoffs or salary cuts or other, job insecurity, and it's significant. So many of the models like yours, the very successful NGOs, are built on many different elements holding up, and this pandemic has sort of hit all of them at once, right? Which is just unprecedented, as you said. I appreciate your sharing that. I know it's not an easy thing to go through as an organization, but I wonder, what do you think it's going to mean for international NGOs going forward? Are you looking at, you said the next 18, 24 months look to you like they could be tough. Is that habitat specific, or you're kind of looking across as you talk to other peers of yours who run the biggest international NGOs in the world? Are they all feeling a similar sentiment? What's your take on that?
They are, it like everything, like in the private sector, they're winners and losers. So if you looked at the total mix, the travel and entertainment, hospitality has gotten hammered. The tech world has actually prospered. I would say the NGOs that are health related are actually doing fine on the revenue side now. The ability to do the work has been highly hampered, but other ones have been really painfully disrupted. Part of it too goes to what the fundraising models look like. So some of the organizations where their fundraising models based on volunteer events, that world has gotten really tough. I think there's been a run of the virtual kind of fundraisers that have gone pretty well, but I think everyone's a little nervous about, as we talk about Zoom fatigue, that people are, it was a novel at first. I don't know how sustainable that will be. And I do worry as so far the US stock market and other stock markets have held up surprisingly well, and that helps for private giving. I think a huge piece will be the willingness of, our bilateral institutions, multilateral institutions, governments to step up and continue to fund internationally. So from a policy perspective, we are advocating strongly to make sure that funds keep going to highest needs places. And I think one of the worries with the pandemic is that people will turn inward in their giving to their local community versus giving internationally, or will turn inward. Governments will be focused locally versus globally. I hope it can be a both and. The needs are great, and it is more important than ever that we not pull back from supporting our low-income contexts around the world. So I would say not fatalistic about it, but I do think it's, if this keeps going as, I think now it's more and more likely new normal doesn't work till we have a widely available vaccine. And if that's the case, we are praying for a much better and faster answer, but planning and preparing for a slower one. And as I talk to peers, I think everyone is deeply concerned, and they are, the longer it goes on, the higher the concern goes.
Yeah, I'm hearing very similar themes as I continue these conversations and talk to a lot of other international organization leaders. If you think of it, just your comments there, the range of possibilities is so wide, right? I can't think of another time when there's been such a range of uncertain possibilities. And as an executive leading a big institution, you've got to sort of plan for all aspects of that, which can't be easy. I want to get you to kind of look in your crystal ball a little bit here. You were talking before about land, about affordability, about some of the broader housing trends that had led us to a crisis point even before the pandemic. Is there a chance that coming out of this pandemic, the clay will be wet in a way we can remold this problem in a new direction, right? So certainly in wealthy countries, there's a new appreciation for internet connectivity. There's a sense that, hey, maybe we can move to second tier cities or satellite cities, or, and of course we're potentially looking at a massive disruptions coming soon around climate, where people who live in affected areas might have to move as well. So migration is a big reason we got to the problems you described of people living in slum conditions. Is there a big migration maybe that could come out of this pandemic and a chance to reframe this housing problem into an opportunity? How do you see it?
I do think it'll be context specific. So in the high income markets, I think this could actually alleviate some of the insane housing pricing. So the reason I believe, a little skeptically, in the United States, housing finally was getting really visible was because middle class families' children couldn't afford housing anymore. So it was suddenly visible. The invisible problem had become visible when rents had gone so high. And
yeah, really, you couldn't be a teacher in San Francisco or New York and teach kids in that city and live in that city, right? It was just didn't make sense.
Morally, philosophically, as we think about cities, we can't really have cities that only people making $200,000 and up can live in. That just doesn't work long term. And even environmentally, it's a nightmare, because then you've got people driving further and further away in order to find affordable housing. That's horrible for their quality of life. And if you think of real shelter costs being the cost of your shelter plus your utilities, really plus the cost of getting to work, there is actually a tax that everybody pays, because that's why then the roads are all clogged. Because people are driving 2 hours or hour and a half each way to get to work, which is horrible for their quality of life, but actually bad for everybody in the context. So I think in the high income context, I was, an anecdote, a friend I was just talking to, his daughter working in Boulder, Colorado for a tech company. They've just said, you know what, you can live anywhere you want. We're going to stay virtual. So she moved to Boise, which is much less expensive, can have a much better house, can have better quality of life with math that works. So I do think where there is internet capability, there is likely, cities are always going to be around. People are going to come to cities for creativity, for jobs, for opportunity. But I do think this will create opportunities to spread a little bit more. I think the challenge in low income contexts will be many people have now left the city back to rural areas because they literally couldn't eat if they didn't move. But how do we then create the job opportunities? And I do think that's going to have to come with infrastructure. So how do we get internet access to those places? And then how do we have enough training, support, and ways that they can have jobs that they could actually do? So it is this great challenge of our knowledge workers win and the non-knowledge workers lose out in so much of our economy now. And I think that's a much more complex problem. But to the extent to which we can get better access out to rural areas, I think that helps. But it's hard to imagine that changes the fundamental move. But we think the biggest opportunity, to your point, is in the secondary and tertiary cities that aren't too big yet. They haven't become mega cities. It's really hard to change the dynamics in a 20 million person city. But it may not be too late to allocate land in advance and plan ahead for the growth of those secondary and tertiary cities before it's too late to build enough housing.
Yeah, I mean, so much of it comes down to what is the development model. And the model has been for so long, well, if you're a really poor country, your big asset is cheap labor.
Right.
And you're going to do light manufacturing, low skilled manufacturing. You're going to steal that business from countries like China. Of course, they've, in a way left it a while ago. And you're going to take that on. That's going to be how people get into the middle class, the factory jobs. And millions of people have moved to cities and end up in slums looking for that kind of labor, looking for service labor. And that kind of labor is really tough to think about going to second tier cities or back to the rural area. On the other hand, the dialogue in a place like the United States and much of the world because of the pandemic is, well, let's bring the manufacturing home. Let's think about 3D printing, and let's think about more robotic approaches to manufacturing. And maybe what has been the development model, the paradigm for so many countries just won't be there anymore. And it does raise a lot of questions about what will happen to these millions of people who move to the city for work. Is the paradigm going to shift? Tourism in so many countries was a major source of revenue. That's down. It's probably going to stay down for quite a while as people in richer countries say, well, I feel safer staying here and traveling around my own country. You think about all the commodity export oriented countries out there and all the jobs associated with that, but oil, gas. I think the paradigm is really maybe shifting. What do you think?
I worry you're right. And I think the short-term disruption is going to be incredibly painful. And then eventually we'll come back. I think that people will want to visit these places. But if you think about in Egypt, you think about Cambodia, think about the places where Nepal, where tourism is a really important part of the economy, and you pull those dollars out, that's a lot of jobs. And then I worry the secondary piece is many of these countries then send workers abroad in order to make money. So remittances, as you know, are such a big part of economies too. And those workers are losing jobs and being sent back home. So I think the giant question for every country is going to be, how do we create good jobs? And ironically, actually, I think housing and construction is a good economic indicator. So the case, in the US context, we're making the case that, hey, if you really care about health, we have to care about housing. If you really care about racial equity, which is such an important conversation in the country right now, you need to address housing because it was such a structural part of how we created so much injustice, was in how housing was formally and mandated to be segregated. But we would also make the case that if we think about infrastructure and job creation, investing in housing is one of the most efficient ways to create good jobs and solve an important problem quickly. And so it is, and I think the housing piece, construction is one of those vehicles. Now we got to get financing, but our view would be if the biggest mistake most cities have made is just not planning for growth. So by not planning ahead, I would actually argue in low and high income contexts, you don't have to build the housing. You just need to allocate land for it because land is the structural problem. So if you build roads, build infrastructure, and then tax that infrastructure for the value creation you were making with it. I think Seoul, Korea did a really nice job. When I lived in Seoul 35 years ago, it was a city of 8 million, big city. Now it's a metro of 22 million. And it did that with very few to no slums relative to all the other megacities. And one of the things they did, and I'm oversimplifying it, but as they ran the train tracks south of Seoul and grew the city step by step, the farmer, who sold that land would get 2/3 of that value creation, but they'd grab 1/3 of that land for housing. So they built housing along the way and along the transit, which of course makes perfect sense. You contrast that with California, which, completely failed to do that. Or the other cities where they just didn't have a formal plan. And so you couldn't stop people coming in, and then it was hard to catch up, and you end up people just everywhere piled in. And so I don't want to pretend any of this is easy, but if the land is there, you can actually then figure out mechanisms for people to build their own housing. And I actually think that's the best model. Tokyo, I think, is a fascinating example. If you think about, people now think of Tokyo as what it is today. Post-World War II, Tokyo was wooden shacks and flattened, and it migrated.
Largely burned to the ground, yeah.
They never made it hard to build. So as it went from, shacks to small houses to bigger houses to small apartment buildings to larger apartment buildings to towers, it was never that hard to build along the way. So it's been, it's now one of the biggest cities in the world, but managed its housing better than most biggest mega cities.
Yeah, there's so much liquidity now sloshing around, and we're regularly just talking about trillions of dollars, certainly in the United States and Europe, as liquidity because due to the crisis. Is there an opportunity in that? I haven't heard a lot of conversation about this at the international level for housing. In fact, I've been shocked by how little ambition there seems to be around funding for global development in general coming out of this, right? There's been we've been reporting on the European Union's fiscal plan and how disappointing that was. And there's very, very little coming out of the United States as well. Is there a big idea that you've got, if you could, given that, mortgage rates and interest rates have dropped so much in the rich countries of the world, given that there's all these new mechanisms for getting money out into the economy, is there a big idea out there around housing globally where we could better finance that infrastructure, better finance affordable housing?
We were just talking about, we do believe that now we got to watch indebtedness, but we do think housing microfinance is scalable. And we've been really excited. We started with very small amounts of capital, lending them wholesale lending to microfinance banks and giving them technical assistance to start doing housing lending, because the belief was you could only lend for small businesses, but you couldn't do an unsecured loan for housing. And what we've seen actually is the repayment rates for housing loans have been as high or higher than the small business repayment rates. And then we launched a wholesale fund called Microbuild that was our first ever leveraged fund, and 90% debt, 10% equity. It is on track, even with COVID, to fully pay back the debt and make a return for the equity holders. And we are looking at the feasibility of a larger scale fund. We're looking at the feasibility in the US of a housing opportunity, larger scale mortgage funding to increase opportunity for low income home ownership, which we think is a gigantic need. The ironic trap of the low interest rates and the amount of liquidity is it actually tends to create real estate bubbles. So at the middle and high ends, that pours money into overvaluing land, and that's a little bit of a long-term trap. So what we've seen is generally that means an overbuilding of mid and high-end apartments all around the world, and not enough building at the low end. And so the question is, what would it take with the public sector, private sector, and civil society to get the carrots and sticks aligned to actually build meaningful amounts of units at the low and moderate end, which is where we've got a huge undersupply. And now as the market will, I think, eventually inevitably have to soften at the high end as all these units come out. I think developers are willing, but the math doesn't work because the land's so expensive. So in some ways, it still comes back to, I think you're going to need subsidy of some form and then financing. So in a way, it's going to be laddering the financial vehicles together. But if you can solve land, there's no question in my mind we can solve all the other pieces. It's the land values because of low rates and people then putting in going into hard assets instead of currency, I think is actually getting in the way of affordable housing. I also think you should break the myth of housing as an investment versus housing as a human need. And so people investing in housing just to flip, tends to exacerbate bubbles and cycles versus housing as a long-term savings and stable environment for kids, which the evidence is overwhelmingly clear.
Yeah, it seems to take us back to your first comment about leaders maybe not understanding this at a visceral level because housing for them isn't so much of a problem, it's more of an opportunity. They might be able to see it more as an investment. And so if they don't get it viscerally, then they have the wrong frame that they bring to this problem, and it exacerbates it.
And and we're part of the problem too. I think civil society, it tends to be fragmented, and we can be our own worst enemies. And we were part of the problem. So if your habitat, housing is the solution to everything. If you're a health organization, health will solve everything. If you're education, if you're a jobs organization, and the reality is we need all of it. And community development doesn't work without all the components coming together in a successful way. And so we have tried, from our perspective, to sort of pull habitat out and then even pull shelter out. And it really becomes then a model of, community health and well-being at the center. And then the different spokes, we would argue, need to include housing, because if you don't have housing, we think all those other key interventions won't work either. Obviously, if families have strong, stable incomes, then they can usually figure out the other pieces. but how do you get them to the point they can get strong income? So it's not easy. And I've been slightly amazed how invisible housing is. We have a great partnership with the United Nations Housing and Human Settlements Organization, UN Habitat, but they get very little funding and very little attention relative to the other parts of the UN. And in the same way, it is relatively rare to find an international, government strategy where housing is one of their kind of lead strategic pillars. And obviously, we hope to change that. We were starting to see movement on that pre-COVID, and we're hoping that doesn't get undone.
Yeah, it is surprising. You're absolutely right. And especially when you think about the numbers you shared earlier around slum dwellers, how would we ever achieve the sustainable development goals if we have more than 1 billion people living in slums? Because how are you going to get the right educational outcomes or health outcomes or income out? You're not going to get them if people are living in those kinds of conditions, which I know you and I have both witnessed. This is not a reasonable way for people to have to live. And you can't expect people to achieve results in other areas of their lives if they're not living in a decent, sustainable way. It is surprising how little that breaks through, I think, in the broader conversations around the SDGs and around global development writ large.
Yeah, no, you're right, Raj. And it's so interesting. And I think we see this goes across every country, that the best model for a child is to grow up into mixed income, mixed use development, right? Where you have role models, you've got access, and you have access to work and access to school. But increasingly, and historically, cities were designed that way. But over the last 50 plus years, we've gone to complete economic segregation. So the wealthy have zoned in a way and gated themselves off with their own security, with their own services, with their own pieces, in ways that I think are really destructive ultimately to everyone. I mean, I would believe morally that's destructive, but even practically that doesn't create a healthy long-term environment, because we're better off actually, if you think about some of the slums that are huge economic engines, you can think about India, you think about Nairobi, it's not that there's not economic value creation there, it's that value is then being extracted to other people and not accruing to the families that are there, because you've got people with decent incomes in some of those places, but they're paying actually very high rents per square foot. And then the land typically of the rents are being extracted to and not staying in the community. So I think the challenge, which is a huge social challenge, is are we willing to create mixed income neighborhoods? And I think I don't have as good data in all the countries, but Raj Chetty's data in the US was just devastating, right? If you looked at social mobility, children in mixed income communities in the United States from low income families still had relatively strong social mobility and prospects for lifting themselves up. If you look at children in concentrated poverty in the United States, it takes a minor miracle for them to break out. There's almost zero. And that's just, that's unacceptable.
Yeah, it's the myth of social mobility, but you need to have certain conditions to make it possible. Right. And I do wonder what your take is. We've talked about how this situation can exacerbate inequality. So far, it has exacerbated inequality, right? Those of us who can work from home, this hasn't been that hard. And of course, when government benefits run out in some of the rich countries, or if you're in a poor country where there haven't been, I've been talking to people in a lot of low and middle income countries where people just have gone from having an income to having almost no income, right, overnight. And of course, those who do have assets, who own capital, who own land, they're in a different position. It's nowhere near as tragic for them. So I guess what I wonder is, do you think there's a real potential we'll come out of this and go further in the direction of gated communities with high fences and security for the rich, and then others living right on the outside of that in squalor? Is that going to just get worse?
I think short term, I fear it will get worse, just because of the trends you said, that if we look, it's the service workers who are losing the jobs, and the knowledge workers are needed more than ever. And so we've got a skills mismatch, and I don't know how fast we can migrate. So I know there are companies who can't hire fast enough, and yet there are huge numbers. I think about, my city of Atlanta, the number of people who are connected in one way to the airport, the convention business, the sports and entertainment business, and all the meetings, and then tourism. So you knock all those pieces out. That's not just all the frontline, hotel workers and airport workers and airline workers, but it's all the agencies and law, it's all the groups that support all of them as well. And that's a lot of jobs, and that may not come back very quickly. So I do think we've got a huge dislocation. We already had the trend you described before COVID, right? It was already moving to a high skill, low skill knowledge economy. And even if we talk about manufacturing coming back, typically that doesn't create tons of jobs anymore because it's high tech and increasingly automated. And what we need is to to raise up skilled. There are still, I'm a big fan of skills-based education because there are, I serve on one of the regional Federal Reserve boards. And so we get a lot of economic data. And going up into COVID, but even with COVID, there are still lots of jobs to be had, but not enough workers with the technical skills for those jobs. And so I do think one of our huge challenges from a societal perspective is reskilling and helping to give young people the skills for where the new jobs are going to be in this dislocation. My fear in countries that were export driven and tourism driven, it's going to be a really painful dislocation. And I hate, it just crushes me to think about, all those families who had lifted themselves up to where, certainly not solid incomes, but sustainable incomes, and then being forced rapidly backwards. And I do think that's going to take transfer payments in the near term. And then how do we get the economic engine moving again?
Yeah, it's absolutely going to be challenging. I wonder, just as we close out here, you were an executive at Disney and Best Buy. You had a business career. Now you're in the nonprofit sector. And as you say, we don't have adjectives for the situation that we're in. It is dramatic. What is your advice to those of us who are out here in the global development field, who care about the SDGs, who are trying to make a difference and seeing, these headwinds, seeing these huge challenges ahead? Presumably this crisis is going to change the way you work. I mean, I know you're in your office today with like one other person you mentioned in headquarters, but work has got to change a lot for you. Travel, being in an industry where face-to-face contact for policy advocacy or fundraising is so important. Given we're in this kind of disruption, what are some of the takeaways you would have for people listening to this who are running their own small nonprofit or working in development in some way, shape, or form? What should we take away from what you've learned so far?
Thanks. One, obviously we can get ourselves discouraged in these conversations. So the first message I would have to everybody is, hey, in the long term, we're going to figure this out and get through this. So it is the worst possible thing is to kind of get into this discouragement spiral. And in fact, for those of you who are leaders, your leadership is more important than ever in terms of supporting your team. But it is absolutely true. I think we have to assume many of our team members are stressed. And in normal life, probably 10% of your team members are having some sort of personal challenge or work challenge. That number is probably way up right now in terms of stressors. So how do we, first thing is to put on your own oxygen mask. What do you need to do spiritually, from prayer, exercise, sleep, whatever you need to do to show up every day virtually for your team and be able to encourage and support them and get them through. Second, keep that that view on the long run. And then there are opportunities that come out of this. I do think now we've learned we can go virtual. I think the new world will be a hybrid, but we've learned we probably could do more virtually than we used to think. I don't think it ever replaces being fully face-to-face, but I do think it may change the way we think about international travel, and we have to adapt. I do think that there are going to be opportunities and new innovations that may get accelerated out of this because we've learned how fast people could move. So some of the things that were already happening maybe can scale much faster now in terms of the power of mobile payments, the power of internet access. I mean, it certainly puts a priority on getting internet access out to all of the communities that we serve, because that is, I think, a ticket to play in the new world for every sector in the economy. It is, I think the people who work in this space are inherently optimistic. I do think there's an opportunity for really changing hearts and minds. And so we didn't talk as much about it, but the advocacy piece is just critical. And I think their chance to get this emerging generation, which is the most globally minded generation we've ever had, and really push, at every level of government for for more interconnection and more support. And I think just as we've proven that none of our countries now can shut the doors. We are all globally interconnected. I think there was this myth that one region having an economic crisis wouldn't impact other regions, and all our supply chains have proven that completely false. So then the question is, how do we get empathy? I do think there's a chance for the SDGs to get more attention, not less, because people have a sense of the preciousness of all of this. But I worry short-term nationalism is kind of the trend that bothers me the most. And those of us who care about international development, those of us who care, have got to spend more time probably on advocacy and policy while we're doing our daily work of service around the world.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Policy advocacy as a concept didn't really exist maybe a couple of decades ago. Organizations like yours said, hey, we're here to build houses and that's what we're going to do. And boy, we've all realized if we want to achieve these goals, we've got to be pushing. In the end, it is about how leaders feel about these issues and how they prioritize them. And it is about politics and policy and getting that message out. So I just want to really thank you for underlining that and for shedding so much light on a key issue that I think doesn't get as much attention as it ought to. Hopefully a moment like this will give it a little more attention. We've had people joining this conversation from all over the world, lots of interesting comments, people on all different platforms joining us, and really appreciate all of you for tuning into what I think has been a fascinating and insightful discussion with Jonathan Reckford. So I just want to thank you, Jonathan, for taking the time to do this and wish you and your whole team at Habitat well.
Great, Raj. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you and catch up. I look forward to that being in person. To all of you out there, thank you for joining the conversation. It's going to take all of us to move this forward. And I do think more than ever, what you all do has never been more important. So thank you for the work you do. God bless you. And we have to be resilient individually and help those we serve be resilient.
Thank you, everybody. Be well.